Hey, welcome to Page Break. I'm your host, Brian McClellan, coming to you on an inversion-y spring morning in the mountains of Utah. A quick reminder that as of recording, we are less than 2.5 months away from the launch of In the Shadow of Lightning. This is a brand new epic fantasy from yours truly, in which we follow a failed prodigy whose mother's murder forces him to return to the cutthroat machinations of the world's greatest empire and discover that the magic upon which the world depends is running out. Get your pre-orders in. Now, on with the show. My guest this week is fantasy author Naomi Novik. Naomi is best known for her massively successful Temeraire series, in which dragons fight in the Napoleonic Wars, and was, as I recount in the episode, an early inspiration for my own writing. She's also written the Scholomance trilogy, standalone novels Uprooted and Spinning Silver, and a host of short fiction. Naomi and I talk about international travel and attending conventions, Naomi's love of fan fiction, her early work in video games, and writing characters, including non-humans, who think differently from modern people. Enjoy my conversation with Naomi Novik. I'm trying to remember. I don't know if we have met since I became a professional.
I feel like we have, but to be honest, I have zero memory of these things.
I've got a really poor memory as well, and if you'll indulge me, I'm going to tell a very stupid little story really quickly.
Okay.
So 20-year-old Brian McClellan was in Brandon Sanderson's one of his very first classes before he even made it big at BYU as a student. And Brandon told everybody that there is a Worldcon going on down in Los Angeles, and that some of the people from the class were going to go down there, and if we wanted to carpool and everything. And so he was giving recommendations on, meeting professionals and all this stuff. And he said, oh, they do these things called coffee clutches. And you should, if you could sign up for one, that'd be great. And so I signed up for one with somebody named Naomi Novik. And I got your books. I think the first 3 were out. Maybe it was either 2 or 3.
Yeah, I think Kelly was yes, that was the last time I've been to a con in LA. I think was 2006, which is literally like the first 3 books came out.
It would have been that one, and I got the books and I rode them in the back of the car, crammed full of students. And I went to your coffee clutch, and I got to just kind of sit, and I was like this bright-eyed, young wannabe writer, and it was so fun, just to spend an hour with somebody who was at the time relatively new to publishing, but had kind of come out and made a big splash, and gosh, I just it's one of those memories that kind of comes back to me occasionally that I really love.
That's great. That's really cool. I have to say, I love coffee clutches. Coffee clutches are my favorite thing at cons, because, very often panels, the panels where you have multiple writers on, it's literally you roll a D20, and if you get the natural 20, then everything's great. And otherwise it's sort of we have said all these things before, and we've all, every once in a while the alchemy happens, and it's a magical experience. But it does feel a little rare. But the coffee clutches, because it's so specific, right? Everybody who comes, it's a limited group. You can really have an actual kind of conversation and talk to everyone there. Yeah, so I love coffee clutches. That's always been my favorite thing. So
well, and I find, as somebody who kind of has always been quite shy in person, that sort of small group is way easier for me to digest and engage with than massive roomfuls of people that are probably only there to listen to the really famous person next to me. And so, it's just so much more fun to kind of engage with.
Yeah, and you also often get sort of much more kind of obscure questions and sort of interesting questions. You can sort of talk and ramble about things, and you can actually have a bit of a conversation as well. And also everyone at the table, when you do have the panel with 6 writers, for all that a large proportion of the people may be there for 1 or 2, especially bigger writers, it's not a single monolithic group. So everybody doesn't have the same frame of reference. And it doesn't, you don't get the same thing as you do with a coffee clutch, where pretty much everybody who's there has read the same books and liked them, and therefore shares a certain kind of taste. And
Hmm.
so yeah, I feel like it's just a nice format. I feel like, there should be more. They should do online coffee clutches, right?
Yeah, I think that would be a lot of fun, actually.
Yeah.
I don't know, like the whole transitioning to kind of a lot of the last 2 years, the online sort of conventions. I
Mhm.
It weirds me out in a way, and I don't think it should, because online is where I live most of my life. But for some reason, it kind of weirds me out, and I I've only gotten invited to a few, and I've turned them all down, and I feel bad about it.
No, I haven't basically done almost any virtual cons. I've done virtual signings, like
Hmm.
virtual talks, where it's one on one with another writer, and either I'm interviewing them or they're interviewing me, or it's a combination, or it's an individual thing. And then what we did do for like my last book release was we would do something like, 25 people would sign up to get a signed book plate, and I literally do like a timed one-on-one with them, 2 minutes a person. They'd get to see me sign the book plate for them in person, and then we'd send it. And that you know that at least approximates the experience. I just don't think, like, a panel, the few times that I've tried to do a panel with multiple people online, I just feel like it gets really hard.
Hmm.
um, but a coffee clutch might, maybe I'm wrong, maybe that would also be a bust. But I do also feel like things will probably be different after we start going back to in-person things more, right? When it becomes a mix of events,
Yeah.
you know, then I think things change, because part of what's making it hard is that after you've done like 20 Zooms, you're just like, I never want to Zoom again, ever. Right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Do you find that you prefer the smaller conventions or the bigger ones?
Um, I actually prefer the bigger ones, to be honest. I find that the bigger ones, partly for purely selfish reasons, which is that I find at the bigger ones, you tend to get like a whole bunch of authors show up, like it's like the gang's all here, and you're, and so for that selfish reason, and for the other selfish reason, which is at a bigger convention, they don't kind of overschedule you. I think that sometimes at some smaller cons, um where, and I think they're doing it deliberately and generously, like they schedule you for 5 or 6 panels. I'm like, I don't have 6 hours of conversation in me over a weekend. And I feel like, I want, I would rather do less but more, right? And then spend time myself, actually, just exploring the convention and talking with people, because I do find actually that conventions are a great place to sort of build conversations and community with other writers, that then lend themselves to a lot of conversation, right? Do you feel?
Yeah.
What about you? What's
Oh,
your favorite?
oh, absolutely. I'm with you. I tend to be the little conventions. Once in a while, you'll find the one that's just an absolute diamond, right? That's just so amazing. It has the perfect number of people that are all the perfect type of people, and they're just amazing. But those are so rare. It almost seems like the little conventions, you more often it skews quite a bit older. It has very low energy. It you kind of you go to those, you go to a whole bunch of panels, and you're talking to the same 15 people kind of again and again and again, and that can be very cool if it works out perfectly. But it's also, yeah, it's also kind of saps your energy and doesn't give you like the big comic cons that have a good writing presence at them. They're so upbeat, and that you keep moving, and you're meeting so many like other professionals, which I'm with you. I love that. That's my favorite part of conventions. Totally.
Yeah. And also, what I feel like, the something that I think could be good is something more like, Clarion, right? Where you have a situation where it's a couple of professionals and a group of aspiring writers who are there to sort of learn more intensively, right? That kind of experience. Um, yeah, but in general, yeah, I generally do find that the bigger conventions, which of course are the things that got canceled the most, right, for good reason, because that was clearly not the wisest idea for a while. But so it's in a way the thing that we couldn't have.
I remember
Hopefully
going
not.
to a little convention in Poland, and
Mm,
it was like my second time overseas ever, and I
wow.
was freaking out, and I just like I didn't obviously speak the language. I didn't know anything. There had been a couple of they were all very lovely people. They were amazing, but there had been a couple of communications crossed, and
Which
so it
where
took.
where was the sorry? Which I've been to conventions in Poland. So which one
Oh,
was it?
it
Was
was
it
the
in Poland?
one. Man, it was a smaller one. It was about 800 people or so at a little castle outside of. Oh man, I forget which city it is. I'm gonna have to go look it up
Was
now.
it the
But
north or the south? Do you remember?
mm,
And that's, but
yeah, no, I'm not
yeah.
remembering now. It was a good 6 years ago, so it's been a
All right.
while
Yeah.
now. But I remember like getting to it. There'd been some paths crossed and everything, and I had ended up taking a taxi to get to the thing, to the event, and I show up and nobody was really there to greet me, and I was freaking out really badly. And I finally get like a little spot, kind of alone, and I'm just kind of like, okay, how am I going to survive this next 4 days? And then like a moment later, Angus Watson walks in, and I had never met him. I hadn't talked to him online, but I recognized his picture and I knew he was going to be there. He walks in, and it was like a I was it was saved. It was like just like another professional that like he also didn't speak the language, and but was way more gregarious than me and way more outspoken and able to kind of he was very used to traveling around the world and stuff. And he honestly he took me under his wing for that weekend, and it saved my life.
Extroverts are so helpful when you can
Yeah.
find them. It's like cling.
It's just like, oh, thank you so much. But like that kind of experience though is really what kind of it definitely is one of the things that I love the most about conventions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully now we get to start having them again,
Right? Fingers
Yeah.
crossed. I'm like sitting on these plans for Spain and France this
Yes,
summer,
I'm
and
I'm
I'm
going to Spain in July. I'm going to Celsius. Is that
oh
one of yours? Yeah,
yes, yes.
come, come. It'll be
I
great.
I'm
Yeah.
planning on it. I'm hoping my wife will come with me, and we'll
Oh,
take a couple extra days.
that's awesome. Yes,
So
I have a friend in the UK who usually comes over to meet me when I do conventions in Europe, and we go traveling. And in fact, I really want. I actually was there just before the pandemic, but I really want to go back to a place in Portugal, which is Sintra, which is unbelievable. If you've never been there,
I haven't. I've never
um,
been to Spain. I've never been to Portugal. I'm very excited.
well, so this is actually sort of the Sintra is a town that's about an hour away from Lisbon,
Hmm.
um, and there's a place there called and I'm going to completely butcher this, so I apologize to anybody who speaks Portuguese. Quinta da Regalia, and Regaillera. Yes, but anyway, if you search for Portugal, Sintra, and the well, you'll bring up the links to this place. It is unbelievable looking. It's basically this garden, this estate, a mansion and gardens were built by this nobleman in like the 19th century, who was sort of into Freemasonry and tarot symbolism and sort of the whole idea of the initiation rites of Freemasonry, and basically had an architect who was of like mind, and they designed this garden that's essentially sort of like an initiation ritual pathway, complete with a sort of descent into the underworld and then a passage through the darkness and then rising back out
Oh my
into the light.
gosh.
And the photographs of it are unbelievable. That you can find the photos online, and but just being there is really kind of amazing. And yeah, it's just a really really cool place.
That
Um,
sounds so dang cool.
Yes. Yes.
Oh
So I
man.
highly recommend. I mean, not that there is any shortage of amazing things to see in Spain. So, um,
Right. I get
but
kind of like locked because I'm not really, I didn't, as a kid, I never traveled overseas. We didn't really, we did family vacations where we'd go stay at a cousin's house kind of thing. You know,
mhm.
like, so I'm so not used to travel, especially after 2 years of COVID. I'm freaking out. I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to get Michelle to go with me. We're going to go to Barcelona. Like, that'll be fun. I don't know what to do once I'm there. Like, I don't know how to
Well,
navigate foreign
I have to say,
countries.
it's like it's now with Google Maps. You kind of you plug it into Google Maps, you hit transit, and you just follow the instructions, and you'll end up where it may not always be the best way. Like sometimes you look on Google Maps tells me how I'm supposed to get someplace downtown. I'm like, nah, I'm better off if I change at this train station instead. But you get there. You get
Yeah.
there. So it really is like a game changer. I find that and Uber and Lyft, which
Mm.
obviously, problematic in many ways, and the business practice is terrible, but the technology is brilliant, right? And the idea of being able to know that, all right, I can piece out of here if I have to. If I've just gotten myself completely lost, I can just push a button and somebody will show up who will know how to take me someplace else.
Right.
Uh,
I do love that. They're like, okay, it might cost me $50, but I can get out of this situation.
right.
I do like that. Well, man, that will be so cool. Oh man, I keep I like have this fear in the back of my head that everything's going to get canceled again from like some new surge of COVID.
It might, but at the same time, we have to kind of live our lives.
Yeah.
And I don't know, for me, I felt very strongly at the beginning about that we, in a way, I feel like we kind of missed the ball in slightly different directions. I feel like we didn't lock down hard enough and vaccinate hard enough at the beginning, and now it's taking a little too long to open up. Where the science just kind of isn't there because but I obviously here in New York we're starting to they're sort of like, oh wait, actually it's okay, and the mask regulations are coming down, and it does feel like, in a way, if it does have to lock down, I think it's better to be like, okay, we have to lock down right now really hard
Hmm.
for like a couple of weeks and then we stop again. And I feel like that's hopefully is that kind of sort of slightly less, sort of less emotional, right?
Yeah.
Kind of process would be better.
I'm
Because yeah.
I'm with you on that. Just like, do it hard, do it decisively, do it fast, and then, but have a limit to it, right?
Yeah, yeah, because I don't know. I feel very differently, when it's like high risk of death versus high risk of getting the flu for 2 weeks. Those are two different things to me, and
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Yeah,
So
and once we're all, like we got our boosters and stuff, that feels
yeah,
feels way less like, gosh, I remember the moment I got like my second shot last summer, I just felt so much better about
yeah.
existing.
Yes, yes. It just sort of like it was, sort of it went by degrees. Like my husband got his first was of a heart condition, and I immediately like stress level like this, and then I got mine and went like this, and then my daughter got hers in the fall, and it was like, okay, I'm done. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which yeah.
It's that cycle, everybody's kind of feels a little differently about it and everything,
Yeah.
but getting it done is it's
Yeah.
important. So I was very curious about your background in video games as
Yeah.
someone who loves video games. You've got a master's degree in computer science.
Yep. Yep.
That
I mean, so like it's sort of one of those weird stories where sometimes you kind of don't know what in like in college, I basically was sort of a little bit of an overachiever, and I basically did the maximum course load every semester so that by my junior year I basically finished all the requirements for my English major. And then my senior year I had sort of burned out, and I spent most of it playing and building online mushes, like text-based games. And yeah, so my senior year was an independent study in online gaming. In early, because there was no video games at the time. It was like Mosaic had just come out basically, and it was pretty much just text-based video games. But then afterwards, so I graduate with my English degree, and in fact, my first job was largely ended up being quite technical. And then I was like, you know what? I want to go get a computer science degree and make computer games. And I went and got the master's, and I was in fact working on a PhD when I got a friend of mine was working with a team that was building the expansion set to Neverwinter Nights.
Mm-hmm.
And so the cool thing about Neverwinter Nights was it was built with a mod kit, a really robust modding tool that they essentially used to build the levels themselves. So, it was technically feasible for somebody at home, like an individual person at home, to build complete new levels of the game. Right, complete new standalone adventures. You could do that with the mod maker.
And that had to have been revolutionary for the time, right?
It was. And of course, the thing that you realize is in practice, and the reason that more companies don't do this, is that in practice, people can't. Because, and here's the thing, storytelling is such a key part of making an actual playable mod. Storytelling, writing, and the tools were not, and still are not, like, you still can't build good enough tools that somebody who's just a good storyteller and not also a reasonably good programmer can do it. And somebody who's good enough at both to produce something that's fun enough to really play, almost certainly is going to have enough demands on their time, other sort of professional demands on their time, that they won't be able to spend the time to do a mod for free. Mm-hmm. Right? It's slightly too big a project. But at the time, because they'd done it, they were like, great, we're going to farm out the expansion set to another company. And so, and because I was both a programmer, and my friend who recruited me was the lead designer. And he was like, we don't actually have the budget for a programmer because this whole tool is built, right? And so they don't think we should need a programmer, but we do have the budget for a designer. So how about you come on and you can do a little coding for us too? Well, and obviously, so it turns out it was not something that non-technical people could easily use.
Yeah.
And they did actually need programmers. So there's but it was still such a wonderful experience to use it and work on it. And and that was for me what actually had me make the transition to being a novelist, oddly enough, because, the process of writing for a computer game. Have you done any computer game writing?
I haven't. I've been invited a couple of times after becoming published, and I simply just don't have the time, even though it's kind of one of those, like, it's one of those things that's kind of like a bucket list item for me that would be super fun if I ever had, like, 4 years off after a major bestseller or something.
Yeah, that doesn't kind of work that way. I think after the major bestseller, the publisher's like, so let's keep going.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
Yeah. No, well, for computer, so the interesting thing about writing for a computer game for me at the time was the structure, right? And the aspect of working with a team. And that we had to make quite a lot of decisions up front. We had to, because the artists literally had to start making the cinematics for, like, the end of the game and the middle points of the game. We had, like, the budget for 4 cinematics, so, like, one after each act, one before and one after each act. And so they needed to know what's going in this cinematic. So you have to nail down certain things quite early. And because it was Neverwinter Nights, it's a Dungeons and Dragons universe, right? And so it was all about building a character. And you had to think about the different kinds of characters that a player could make, and how the decision trees worked in the dialogue for the NPCs and for the henchmen characters, which were a big part of the process. And uh, just sort of um, thinking about that from a storytelling point of view, that kind of analytical engineering aspect of building the story, uh, kind of helped me, I think, engage that sort of analytical half, the engineering half of my brain, more closely with the creative side, the storytelling side, where I'd been writing fanfic for years by then. Um, and but all my fanfic had been short. All my fanfic had been like 2,000, 5,000 words. You know, that was kind of it. Uh, Before I worked on Neverwinter Nights, and literally afterwards, you know, I I have like the next. First of all, the year when I worked on Neverwinter Nights, there I didn't post a single fanfic story. It's like nothing. And then afterwards, it was like I wrote a 5,000 word story, 10,000 word story, 16,000 word story, 30,000 word story, and then I was like, I started working on something. I was like, wait a second, this doesn't want to be fanfic. This is mine.
Yeah.
And that was Temeraire. And so yeah,
Oh,
that's kind of
that's very cool. Like it is funny to see that kind of that very direct kind of transition from one thing to the other. It's a really quick swing.
yeah.
That's really interesting.
Well, it's just, you know, you sort of, in a way, that's one of the things that I think um, doesn't get sort of thought of as good advice sometimes, and I think is, which is sometimes trying different art forms um, is really good for helping you move to another level. I find that I feel that way about vidding. I feel like working on vids, fan vids, uh, made me a better writer, because sort of thinking about the rhythm, seeing scenes, sort of cinematic scenes, looking at them in terms of frame and color, um, sort of looking at the way that characters move and sort of articulating that, and having to train your eye to see it, uh, kind of makes you think about writing differently. And
Yeah.
I feel the same way about, you know, like painting miniatures or knitting, or, you know, almost any kind of different art form. I frequently, I don't know. What about you? What do you do when you're not writing?
I mean, I play a whole lot of video games, to a horrible degree, although I'm getting better about it. I started about 3 weeks ago. I started sketching. I kind of decided that I wanted to. I've never had any like artistic bone, like physical art kind of bone in my body, and I was like, maybe I should just try it just for fun. And I like leapt straight into the deep end of like trying to do figure drawing, and and I did one that I worked on all afternoon. And my wife came over and went, "You realize that is you realize the head is all the different sizes, the wrong size, but everything else looks really good. Like this is literally the first time you've ever done this." And I was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Okay, if you get some pointers, you might actually improve." And I'm like,
No, it's right.
"Okay,
Yeah, no, it's sketching. I remember that there is a moment with sketching, right, with figure drawing, um, where all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, I have to look, right? You have to learn how to see the line and not think about it in your head, right? You have to just
yeah."
learn to like actually see what is actually there, and it's quite hard. And then once you make that transition, all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, and then of course, you know, you still have to develop the hand skill to do it.
Well, and something I've always struggled with is that sort of looking and paying attention to very particular bits. Like I'm pretty good at the kind of the big picture of writing epic fantasy, and it makes me pretty good at intertwining lots of point of views and things like that, is because I'm quite good at the big picture. But there are times I really struggle at stopping and looking like directly at little tiny individual pieces. And like right away with sketching, that was the first thing that like I kind of went, oh, this is something I'm going to have to learn like as a skill.
Mm-hmm. Right. I know so many writers, I know some writers who really can do, who are so wonderful at like the sensory detail, right? You read a scene and you can smell, you can smell it, you can taste it, you sort of really feel the embodied characters, you're sort of there with them. Um, and then the entire story is literally the two characters sitting. They don't move, they don't do anything, nothing happens. And it's just this sort of experience, that it's just the conversation between them. And I have a good friend who's absolutely brilliant at that sort of sensory, sensual kind of detail, and finds it very hard to be like, what happens? What do they do? And then conversely, I know writers who are just brilliant at sort of like okay, this is what happens next, generating that.
Mm-hmm.
But need to be reminded. I am one of them to be like, okay, stop, think a little bit. What is happening in this scene? What are the emotions? I know why the characters are. Why the characters are doing it. Why? tell the reader, right? And kind of digging in really to that level of detail.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you on that. I have that sort of I'm pretty good at having a flow through a scene. I'm good at having the characters move around organically. Like go pour a glass of wine. Call for the maid. All the little tiny things that humans being do when they're in the room together. Right. I'm quite good at that. But like, man, when it comes to like, oh, I remember they actually will smell something. Like what are the senses that are hitting them? What are the emotions they're feeling? And I have to stop and think about those things.
Right. And very often, one of the things that I find is important, right, is to sort of, let the flow come, right? Whatever is flowing, that's what you just have to get out of the way and let it go on. But I do find that going through with that sort of mental editor, in fact, that writer that I was talking about, I often have her in the back of my head when I'm going through a scene, when I'm reading, and I'm like, all right, what would she do in these scenes, that kind of thing.
Oh, that's good. That I need that little voice in my head. Maybe I can still develop it. But you're a huge advocate for fan fiction. And I really was curious about that, because I mean I'm 30 something episodes, nearly 40 episodes into this podcast, and I don't think we've talked about fan fiction with any of the authors I've had come on. And so when I realized how big of an advocate you were for fan fiction, I was like, okay, we're gonna stop and we're gonna discuss that a little bit. I'm very curious about it.
I mean, I just started writing fanfic. Well, I made up fanfic in my head for years before I actually became part of fanfic community, right? Online fandom.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, the thing about fanfic, which, obviously now I feel like people have sort of gotten over it. I do remember when I started writing professionally that there was this sort of sense of like, that I sort of felt like I had to basically just go in up front and be like, just to be clear, I write like fanfic, and I'm going to keep writing fanfic, and I'm proud of it, and I'm going to talk about it, and advocate for it, and that was somehow a brave thing to. It was not, it was like, spoiler alert, not so brave, but that was sort of the sense. And I did know many fanfic writers who went pro and pulled all their fan fiction off, destroyed all evidence that they had ever written fanfic, wouldn't admit it if they were asked. And, and obviously this is I mean, this is all kind of connected to the stigma that was basically a kind of a sexist and homophobic stigma, largely, that responded to the fact of media fandom, um, and that fanfic fandom largely grew up out of Star Trek, and it was people who wanted to, who didn't so much want to talk about science fiction in general and science fiction and fantasy literature. They wanted to talk about Star Trek. They wanted to tell more stories about Star Trek, and that there was this sort of, historically, when you talk to some of the people from early media fandom, from early like sort of Star Trek and fanfic fandom, um, they really articulate this experience of being pushed out of conventions, right? Being pushed out of science fiction conventions, and being made to feel unwelcome, being sort of looked down on, because there was a sense of, um, what those conventions were supposed to be was about kind of lionizing the writers, the professional writers, um, and kind of in a way that was meant, that was sort of like, and you ladies are getting your icky hands on our stuff, kind of way, that
Yeah.
and obviously that's, fan fiction fandom is very typically very heavily female. It's quite heavily queer as well, and that's partly because, right, these are, fanfic becomes more compelling, it becomes the more compelling, the less that the narratives of mainstream culture are written for you, right? The harder that it is for you to find stories that speak to you in the mainstream, um, the more likely you are to be like, well, I like pieces of this story. I like this universe. Now, how can I put myself into this? How do I get the story that I want, which is just literally never being told to me? And that is, I think, a huge part of where the impulse comes from. Um, and then the other impulse is, I think, uh, one of the things about fan fiction, right? One of the things that fan fiction gets criticized for is a lack of originality, right? Um, and the thing is that, the to me, obviously, there are many different definitions of fanfic. But my definition of fanfic is something that's being done in community, right? And it is the shared universe, right? The fact that you're all in this mass universe that you all know about because it's broadcast and watched by millions of people every week, right? Or whatever, whether that's Star Trek or whatever. Which is, that gives you the shared ground to talk to each other with, right? It's like English, you speak the same language. But in this case, the language that you speak is the building blocks of story, right? It's that you share a common canon. It's that you share characters and expectations for those characters. And then with those expectations, you play with them in different ways. And what a lot of people want out of fanfic is not, in fact, good fanfic is not, a good piece of fanfic is not a good tie-in novel, right? Tie-in novels, typically are intended to feel like a real piece of the canon, right? Fanfic is not meant to feel that way. Fanfic is typically about, how about something completely different, right? Let's take these pieces and put them together in a totally different way. Let's create the relationship, Kirk Spock. Let's have this relationship instead. How does this change the story? Let's tell this story instead. And it's all about using those building blocks of story to tell different stories than the ones that you were getting. And so the place where the originality is happening is not in the same place, but it's still there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. It's such a funny thing because I started off kind of my first real attempts to write were fan fiction. And I went for about 2 years in my mid-teens where that's what I was doing. And it was like Wheel of Time fan fiction is where I kind of started off. And then there was a point at which
Which, look, Wheel of Time is kind of like Tolkien fan fiction, right? I mean,
right.
yeah.
And there was a moment at which kind of I probably read something to the extent of fan fiction isn't real writing. If you want to be serious, then you have to, do your own worlds. And I left it behind and I never went back. And, sometimes I think about that and I wouldn't have the time to do fan fiction nowadays, but like I sometimes think about that and I think, oh, I kind of robbed myself of kind of the fun. I started off as like a 14-year-old looking for smut and stumbling upon like a gigantic fan fiction website. And then reading these, like, I still remember a story that was massive and fantastically written that was like Star Wars invades the Star Trek universe.
Right.
And I loved it. I ate that up. And that kind of got my creativity going. And like, I love that kind of those mashings of things like that.
Yeah.
And
the thing that I mean, obviously, look, in fact, I actually strongly urge newer writers to write fanfic for a couple of reasons. One is the idea that it's not real and you should, I mean, that makes no sense literally in terms of any kind of art or any kind of artwork. When you think about like music, right? Does anyone tell you, no, you shouldn't practice Mozart and Beethoven. You should be composing your own music. No, you learn music theory. You practice great music. You learn by doing it. You learn by playing it. You learn by listening to it. I mean, that's, so much great music is sampling and remixing. And that is how, I mean, Picasso, right, is like, good artists make their own, great artists steal, right? That's how it works. It's about, not, and so for that reason, I think that just the fact of with fanfic, if you from a purely sort of craft oriented point of view, right? With fanfic, you can choose the part of the story that the part of writing, the part of craft that you want to work on, right? If you want to work on sort of character vignettes, you can write a piece of fanfic that's literally set in the middle of a plot that's just like a missing scene, right? In fact, this is what a lot of people write. It's just like an emotional moment between two characters that you set in the midst of a plot. So you don't have to worry about plot. You've got the cause, right? You've got the plot structure around you to give you the reason for the emotions, and then you just work on the emotions, right? If you want to work on plot, but you don't want to work about developing characters, right? You take existing characters and you can tell a new plot with those characters and think about, all right, what would these characters do next in this universe given this event, right? And because the rules of the universe are set up for you, the characters are built for you, you can think more about plot. If you want to think about building characters, you can build your own characters and put them in the universe and have them interact with other established characters, right? So in a way, fanfic really kind of lets you zero in on the piece that you want to work on, if that's how you want to use it. But, frankly, even more importantly than that, right? For every person who's interested in writing fanfic, there are at least 100 people who just want to read it. Yeah, right? Yeah. And because you are in a community, because you're in this shared universe, they can read your story. And even if you're not a very good writer yet, right? Many people can read and get enjoyment from your story, right? Just because they already know the characters. They're with you. Right.
It's already introduced. They know they know what Star Wars and Star Trek and Wheel of Time are.
And they already care, and they already want to see. And chances are, if you've thought of a story that you want to tell, somebody else would like to see that story, right? And And so even if you don't tell it in the most polished way, and even if, the dialogue is not great, somebody will read it and give you respond to you.
Hmm.
And that response, that interaction, I think is so valuable as a writer. Getting that feedback, learning what stories speak to other people, learning when you've succeeded and when you failed, as a writer is so incredibly useful. Um,
And it's a bit of a crucible too, right? You go through this process before, maybe even before you've ever taken a creative writing class or done anything formal, and so you've been exposed to the idea of strangers looking at what you create, which is honestly a massive block for a lot of people.
Right. Well, and I mean, in fandom, the thing is, of course, it's not strange. It's like, yay, right? There's this wonderful cartoon that I've seen that people use in fandom when it's like, it's there's like a little cartoon, and somebody is bringing a cake to a potluck, and they look over and there's this like gorgeous 3-tier cake, and they have a little cake, and they're like, oh, their cake is better than mine. And the second picture is like somebody with a fork and knife going, 2 cakes, right? With such glee. And that's what fandom is. Fandom is 2 cakes. It doesn't matter because of a voracious appetite. Like, people who are in fandom are in it precisely because they want more of the thing that they love, and they love it so passionately. That they've gone online. They've actually taken the trouble to go online and type in a search for whatever it is that they want to read, and so they're there for you. And it's a supportive community, and that's so good, I think, for a lot of writers.
Do you think that maybe the establishment, I say that in air quotes, struggles so much with the idea, or at least used to struggle a lot more with the idea of fan fiction because it's not quantifiable, because by its nature it can't be monetized. So you can't say, oh well, that'll sell 100,000. Like it's
Well,
not a
so
thing.
look, I mean, I have to say that it, people started giving fanfic writers much less of a hard time after 50 Shades of Grey.
I was
Uh,
gonna
you
mention
know,
that, right?
because it's like, that's the thing in this country. The idea that you might make art for pleasure and for joy and for your own creativity, and not to make money, confuses people, because they often think of writing in particular, but of art in general, as work. And
Hmm.
and there's this weird creepy mindset that, work, that labor has to produce money, and that you're not allowed to just do things that make you happy, and which is a totally terrible, toxic, late capitalism mindset. But uh, but so then 50 Shades of, but in this country, if something makes $1 billion, then it's automatically okay.
Right.
Right? It's automatically good. It doesn't matter how horrible it actually is. In a certain level, people are like, oh, that's all right then. You
Well,
know,
I definitely struggle with that same thing. My parents were very supportive of me wanting to be an author, but my dad also was very logical and very straightforward of, okay, well, that's great if you want to do this, but how is it going to pay the bills? And so that's been my mindset my entire career. And
right.
and
Well, and look,
sometimes
here's the thing: you need to pay your bills, right? It is a good and important thing to think about, and a good conversation for parents to have with their children. How are you going to pay your bills? But I have a lot of friends who they don't want to pay their bills by writing. They want to write. Just like there are a lot of people who do not want to be professional touring musicians, because being a professional touring musician is not a life that many people want. Many more people enjoy like playing the guitar on the weekend with their friends, or sitting down at a piano and playing for their enjoyment, than they do to, I don't know, than want to like be traveling around in a van, peeing in bottles, right? I mean, it's just like, but I know touring musicians, so I know the let, right? That's not, and for writers, I often say, whenever somebody's like, what how do I become a writer, and like what makes you a writer, etc. I often say that what makes you a writer, what makes you an artist, is that you sit down and write. And if you don't want to sit down and write, then why would you do that? But just because you want to sit down and write does not mean you necessarily want to produce to deadline. Doesn't mean you want to do copy edits. Doesn't mean you want to do like structural edits. Doesn't mean that you want to think about producing commercial manuscripts. Doesn't mean that you want to like do promo. Doesn't mean all sorts of things. And you don't have to. It's okay to literally just like to get a job that pays your bills, and then in your free time write just for yourself. you know and that's okay. That's a good thing. It's a good thing to make art. We are art making creatures.
Well, and as you mentioned before, it's also a community thing. That's it's one of the many ways that human beings create community for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of more broadly, right? Obviously, the archive of our own, right, is literally this complete thing that we built as a group, that our community built, the archive, and it's literally for free. Doesn't when you look at it, people are always really confused now when they look at the archive. Very often whenever we run our fundraisers, they're all like, oh, they're all getting paid $1 billion, why would you donate money? And we're like, nobody is getting paid. Nobody has been paid. It's never been like, it's all volunteers. It's volunteers all the way, right? There are actually a handful of contractors who've been paid to write like especially boring bits of code over the years, but for the most part, it's all volunteer run. It's all volunteer built. The servers are owned by a nonprofit, and all of that is because of community, right? Of people who themselves don't actually want to write. Our sysadmins don't particularly write. They like to read fanfic. That's why they care. But there are people who don't want to write fanfic, but they are like passionate. They have that librarian gene, and so they care passionately about tagging and wrangle the tags. There are people who volunteer to do literally support, to answer people's questions, and do technical support for them. Everybody is volunteers, and that's all just from the community.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Do you read fanfic of your own stuff?
I generally don't, and in fact, I generally don't like to read fanfic of books, because with books, if it doesn't quite nail the author's voice, right, the narrative voice, I mean, then it often feels wrong. It's quite hard for me to get over that, because I see the author too much. I don't get to immerse myself in the same way. And with Temeraire, I remember reading a piece of Temeraire fanfic and being like, Temeraire would not say that. And that's death to the story. That it's like you can't enjoy the story at that point. So I generally don't tend to read fanfic of my own stuff, but I love that people write it. So yeah. I highly endorse it. And in fact, what I do try to do is, as a writer, I'm very often thinking about like, what can I put in here that fans of this pairing would enjoy, fans of this character would enjoy? What can I do to give people a little sort of details that I know other people will hang fanfic stories off of, right? To provide that kind of openness in the work, and invite people in to create in the work.
That's very cool. It would never have kind of, because I do kind of consciously keep my audience in mind when I'm writing things, but it would never even occur to me to try to, like, even with little fiddlings, kind of create something for fanfiction writers.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing is that that's the sort of thing where I do think, and to go back to your question of like, why is there a certain kind of mainstream negative reaction to fanfic? I do think that it comes down to the sort of idea of authority, right? And authority is the sense of control. It's a sense of power. And some people want that. Some people really want that and don't like the idea that, and I think possibly experience like, well, how about if I told your story but differently, as critique, right? As opposed to, it's just another way, right? The road not traveled. And it's the joy of being able to go down the road not traveled is not, it doesn't mean that the road you took was bad, right? It just means there's a really cool road over here too that maybe you didn't see because there's a signpost and it got turned around, right? So that you had to be coming from a different angle to see it, and that, and so, but you do have to recognize, right? One of the things that I think underlies fan fiction and underlies is one of the pillars for why I feel like fan fiction is sort of morally right, is that you can't tell fan fiction about something that you haven't accepted into your brain, right? You have to know the universe, you have to know the characters, you have to sort of have it has to exist in your head, and then the thing that you write has to come back out from you. And so, when you think about the reading experience, right? And this is the thing that we often want to think that the quality of our book depends on us and our work, right? And that's 50% true, right? That's it. 50%. That I will go to the wall that 50% is the absolute maximum that you can control the quality of your book. And the other 50%, and probably more, right? I think actually, if I'm honest, I think it's probably like 90% of the quality of the book is in the reader, right? It's in what the reader brings to your book and the reader's experience of it, and whether they are in a place for your book, whether the book lands right for them in the time they are in, if they share enough of a frame of reference with you, right? I mean, like, just to take it to sort of the bare the bare minimum. If somebody does not read English and I give them my book in English, it's not going to be a good book. It doesn't matter how much work I've done, right? They cannot enjoy my book and they can't read it. But just sort of even more generally, and I think that acknowledgement of lack of control is hard, is often hard for a lot of people. And, to sort of embrace fan fiction, to really sort of be like, well, I'm not going to write these two characters having a romantic relationship, but I'm going to leave an opening for somebody else to put them together, in a way that level I think of change to the narrative is sufficiently large that people do find like, no, I don't want those two characters together. If I wanted them together, I would put them together, and I don't want you to do it either. But I'm just sort of like, sorry, it's in my head. You don't get to control how I think, right?
Yeah.
You don't get to, you get to offer me your thoughts. You don't get to stop me having mine, right?
Yeah, that's a really good. I think that's a very healthy way of looking at it. It's
Right.
like I've always been a little bit obsessed with kind of control of what I'm working on, to the point where I'm also obsessed with collaborative storytelling, but I do not participate in it at all because I so much want to be in control of the thing that I'm working on that I would very much struggle with trying to do it with someone else. But I think that it's way healthier to kind of to be open about these things and to try to make it a dialogue in some ways, whether you're telling a story
Right.
with someone else or participating in a wider universe through fan fiction.
Right. I mean, that's, and honestly, that I do feel that all the writing that I'm interested in doing, right, is always a conversation, right? I do think dialogue is the right word, that it's always in conversation with something else. And whether or not, I feel like it's, and fanfic is sort of like having a really close, intimate conversation, right, with one other person, That's fanfic, or two other people if you do a crossover, right? And that's kind of what it is, right? Sorry to take this back to like coffee clutches and panels, right?
Yeah.
So fan fiction is like a really good, one-on-one, right, with one other person, right, where what comes out of it is this thing that the two of you kind of make together, and even if the other person doesn't know that they were, their book is there, their show is there, whatever. Where original fiction tends to be a little bit more like, um, either you've sort of brought, like, a whole bunch of people are standing behind you whispering things to you, and you're like synthesizing it and sharing, something like that, right? I don't know, but I feel like that's if your work isn't in conversation with something, then it wouldn't be interesting. It is in conversation with other things. It is in conversation with the inspirations and whatever else you're taking in, whether that's could be in conversation with the real world. It can be conversation with history. It can be a conversation with other books. It can be a conversation with movies. It can be in conversation with music or art or drawing, right? But it's got to be in nothing truly stands alone. So fan fiction, I think, is a little bit more like how close is the thing you're talking to.
I've never really thought about it in terms of conversations like that, and I really quite like that. I think that's really cool. And I'll probably spend the rest of the day thinking about, what am I writing right now, and what is that in conversation with? Because one of the things I really like about these conversations that I have with other professionals is kind of learning the way that they think about how they interact with their art and with their business and with everything they do as a professional, in ways that that haven't even occurred to me sometimes.
Yeah.
Now, I was curious, because we talked a little bit about that conversation with the real world, and and your books tend to have one foot in the real world still, and I was kind of curious what, as somebody who writes secondary world, almost, I was going to say exclusively, but I have a book over my shoulder right here that's set in Cleveland. So,
Well, and in fact, my next one's going to be a secondary world fantasy, actually. Yes.
Right, but so what is it that draws you to the kind of alternate history, alternate real world kind of stuff, as opposed to fully creating your own?
I mean, mostly just that I love history, right? I'm a history nerd. I started the Napoleonic Wars because I love the Napoleonic Wars. I read my first biography of Napoleon when I was 10. And I just, I was actually, that's why he had to be my villain, because I was a fangirl. So I knew he had to be the bad guy. No, but, yeah, I mean, I love history and I love period writing, partly because it's actually quite easy to catch the flavor of it, right? In fact, I think that when you're writing, the more distinct, the as a relatively newer writer, especially at length, I did find it easier to find a distinctive voice in Temeraire, partly because I was, I had sort of dislocated myself from my own sort of dialect, right, of English, and was thinking about the word usage, and the rhythm of sentences on that level. And I think look, I think that really a lot of what makes writing pleasurable, writing and reading pleasurable, is the flavor of the words, right? There's two separate things, right? There's the flavor of the text, and there's the sort of the experience being created, and being narrated, and the combination of those two things, I think is the where you get the big bang for the buck. And so I found working in history, with historical voices, and also that, one of the other things that I like, and it's one of the reasons that, for instance, I enjoy writing aliens and monsters and dragons as people, which is I really like kind of trying to think of sort of non-typical human mindsets, right? Characters, beings, the entities that think, that are internally consistent, are rational and internally consistent. So they're not crazy, but they don't think like they don't think the way that we now consider rational, right?
Yeah.
That the conclusions they reach are not necessarily like the conclusions that we would reach. And I think that's one of the things that's fun is that, the past is another country, right? They do things differently there. That gives you a chance to write people who I think nevertheless are people, but do think differently. They're in a different culture. They have different expectations. They reach different conclusions. They have different cultural assumptions, and playing with that is like going to another planet. It is like writing about dragons. It is that. So I think that's part of why I like that. And I mean, obviously, the other piece, is so for Temeraire, in fact, in particular, there was a thing that I wanted to do in Temeraire, which is I wanted you to believe in the dragons, right? I wanted you to believe in them in a specific way, which is I want the reader to think of the dragons as actual sort of physical creatures in the world, plausible, that are as believable as a sailing ship, right?
Yeah.
You don't see sailing ships very often. Most people have never been on a like an actual like man of war, right, from the age of sail. But you know that they exist, right? They feel real in your head when you hear about them. I wanted the dragons to feel the same way. And doing that in period, right, is effective because the extent to which the technology is accurate, right? So for instance, like the way the rifles, they had rifles on the dragons that work like actual rifles, right? The harness is meant to feel and be used in similar ways to the way that ropes and cables are used on a sailing ship, right? The technology is meant to feel all kind of on the same plane and slightly different from our technology. And so in that way, it makes the dragon technology and then ultimately the dragons themselves more real, right? It embeds them in the period, and then because they've been embedded in the period, which is not our period, the whole thing kind of solidifies a bit, right? So it's sort of like borrowing from the realness of history to give some of that to the fantastical thing that you've created.
Well, and I did the exact same thing with Powder Mage with the same time period, which was just to say, okay, what can I do different for, in my case, for straight up epic fantasy secondary world? But what can I do different, but also make it feel familiar to the reader? Well, because I knew that, any guns in epic fantasy would be viewed with, some suspicion by a lot of the readers. And creating a kind of a very Napoleonic feeling setting. It was even the people that aren't familiar with the time period very much, they still read about it in school. It's still in the back of their head somewhere. They still recognize it as this European sort of thing. And I'm right there with you that it's exactly the kind of the thing that I wanted to grasp from that time period.
Right. And I do think that is a very effective, right? There's a reason that people do it a lot, right? And if you are making a pure fantasy world, right? If you are, in fact, I've literally been reading, there's this wonderful blog, there's this wonderful phrase, right? This quote of like, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you first must invent the universe.
Yeah, it was Carl Sagan, right?
Right, exactly, and so that, right, and so if you're trying to build a secondary universe, you do need to use history. You do need to use the real world. You have to have a foot in the real world to make a new world. You have to, because otherwise, I mean, it's just, what do? Where does the reader even begin? The reader can't understand. Even the ways in which it's not like the real world are what tell the reader, right, what is going on. And otherwise, so you do, I think, have to be grounded whenever you're making, whenever you're telling fantasy. Obviously, it still has to make sense.
Yeah, very much so. It's that it's enough to you have to give the reader something to hold on to, so that they can slip into your alien feeling fantasy world in some way. And sometimes it's not a very big jump, and sometimes it's a massive jump. And the bigger you want that jump to be, the more you're going to have to work on all the other structures and everything that keep a reader kind of invested.
Right.
And it can be difficult, but it's also, it's also super rewarding when you get that balance right.
Right.
So I like to kind of try to wrap up these conversations by asking everybody the same question.
Okay.
Which totally out of left field. What's the last thing that you ate that blew your mind?
Last thing I ate that blew my mind. I'm like, I mean, I like to cook, actually, but the thing that blew my mind, it's actually not a single thing. There's a restaurant here in New York called Youngsik, which is sort of like modern Korean inspired cuisine. And you ever go to a Korean restaurant, they usually start by giving you lots of sort of pickles and kimchi at the beginning. And so this restaurant, they changed it. So they served you like 5 amuse-bouche. And I cannot actually tell you right now what any of them were, but they were all just unbelievable. It was sort of like each one was sort of like a different bite, and you could see the origin. You could see like the connection to the kind of thing that you would have been given in like a traditional set menu. But it was all just completely different. And that sort of blew my mind. I really loved that. That again, it was in conversation. So
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that.
Oh, that sounds great. I became obsessed last fall with Michael Palin's work on kind of like he does these amazing books on the way we eat food and do drugs and all these other things. And I became totally obsessed with these ideas of pleasure as community. And community building, and I just it's a weird sort of like near religious experience for me.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I do think food obviously is one of those other things that really builds community as well, right? Gathering people around a table, that sort of thing.
Yeah, having something to just sit down and talk about. I mean, that's why you go out for lunch with your friends,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
it's a base. I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
That was author Naomi Novik. Thanks so much to Naomi for taking the time to chat. You can find links to her website and social media down in the show notes. You can find me, as always, at brianmcclellan.com. Special thanks to James Sutter for music and Tom Bishop for production. If you'd like to support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/pagebreak or buy my books in ebook, paperback, or audio. Don't forget that my next epic fantasy, In the Shadow of Lightning, is now up for pre-order. You can also get signed copies of my books direct from my website or swag from my Redbubble store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Huge thanks to Kyle Anderson, Patrick Hunt, Elijah, and Jennifer and Angela Johnson for their backing on Patreon.